Civilizations rarely decline in a dramatic moment. More often the change is gradual, a long descent of certainty to discomfort, from shared identity to competing agendas. In our own time, it seems that public conversation is growing increasingly tense and polarised. Institutions that once commanded confidence now feel distant and even irrelevant. The pace of life has accelerated while reflection is slowly disappearing altogether. And the void is constantly being replaced by rage and reactionary opinions. The surface of societies across the Western world may still appear largely stable, yet something deeper is evidently shifting. The ideas that once provided coherence are losing their authority. The moral language that once held our societies together is becoming contested or even altogether discarded. The important truth to remember, though, is that this is not the first time in history that societies have faced such junctures. Certainly the scale and the volume may be different, but the essential causes and the ingredients are the same as they have ever been. Sometimes such societies have collapsed entirely, lost to the sands of time. But at other points in history, such societies have found reformation. There is one thing that is remarkably consistent, though, about the historical model of the reformation of society, and it is this. It always begins with a remnant, never the majority. Small groups of people begin to gather around deeper questions and ideas. They read more carefully, they think more slowly. They attempt to preserve intellectual and moral traditions that the surrounding culture has begun to neglect. And more often than not, it is a process of rediscovery rather than of invention. These people rarely think of themselves as forming a movement, yet taken together they represent something that has appeared repeatedly throughout the history of civilization. They represent what might be called the remnant instinct. When societies are confident and stable, intellectual life tends to flourish in the open. Institutions transmit knowledge effectively. Cultural traditions reinforce shared moral assumptions, and public debate, while often noisy, still rests on a foundation of common understanding. But when that equilibrium begins to break down, the cultural environment changes. And in our era, it would appear that we are seeing this in real time. Public discourse is becoming increasingly reactive. Complex questions are reduced to slogans. Ideological camps have hardened to the point where very few actually listen with interest to an opposing view, but rather pause only long enough to then shout down or even to insult those holding a contrary worldview or opinion. In effect, thoughtful disagreement is replaced by tribal certainty. The louder the conversation becomes, the less people are actually listening to each other. Yet, often in times such as these throughout history, beneath the noise, another process quietly begins. Individuals and small communities often begin searching for deeper explanations. They recognise that the surface conversation no longer addresses the real questions. Instead of joining the shouting, they begin preserving something more durable. And history provides many examples of this phenomenon. During the late Roman world, early Christian communities quietly developed intellectual and moral traditions that would outlast the empire that surrounded them and that even tried to crush them. After the collapse of Roman authority in Western Europe, monastic communities preserved learning, philosophy, and classical texts, while the political structures all around them disintegrated. Across other civilizations, similar patterns appear. In periods of upheaval, small circles of scholars, philosophers, or believers continue to cultivate traditions that the wider culture has temporarily abandoned. These groups rarely control political power. They do not typically dominate public debate. Their influence, though, lies elsewhere, often in family and friend groups, which then spill over into the larger community. Whether they are conscious of it or not, they preserve. The etymology of the word preserve originates from the late 14th century Middle English word preserven, rooted in the medieval Latin preservare, to keep, to guard, to preserve. It breaks down into the Latin prefix pre, before, and servere, to keep safe or to maintain, literally meaning to guard beforehand, to keep. In biblical language, such communities are described as salt and light, small in number, but quietly essential to the health of the wider society. The role of the remnant is not to conquer culture, but to sustain it, to keep it safe. Because remnants often exist outside the dominant mood of their time, they are frequently misunderstood. Because they are often out-of-the-box thinkers, that often refuse to be identified along tribal lines, they can often be labelled as non-conformists, even as pessimists. However, the remnant instinct is not driven by despair, nor is it driven by a desire to escape society. It is driven by the recognition that civilizations require deeper foundations than the slogans of any particular tribe or agenda. When those foundations weaken, the most important work is not always political mobilization or cultural conflict. Sometimes the most important work is simply preservation. Ideas must be protected. Traditions must be transmitted. Moral language must remain intelligible even when the wider culture has become confused about its meaning, even to the extent of redefining the meaning of the words themselves. Remnants do not abandon civilization, and they certainly refuse to abandon critical thinking. In their own quiet way, they help ensure that civilization survives its periods of confusion. The remnant instinct tends to manifest through certain recognizable traits. First, there is curiosity, a refusal to accept shallow explanations for complex problems. Individuals with this instinct continue asking questions when the surrounding culture prefers certainty. Second, there is intellectual patience. Serious thinking requires time. Remnants are willing to move more slowly than the pace of modern media and political reaction. As a result, they often see further into the future than those addicted to the constant noise of popular opinion. Third, there is moral seriousness. They recognise that societies ultimately rest upon moral assumptions about justice, responsibility, and human dignity. And finally, the remnant instinct is often grounded in faith, not always in a narrow or dogmatic sense, but in the recognition that truth transcends the temporary fashions of any particular age. Religious traditions have often provided the moral vocabulary that allows deeper ideas to survive periods of cultural instability. These qualities are really fashionable in turbulent times. Yet history suggests that they are precisely the qualities that allow civilizations to endure their periods of imbalance. Every age believes its own challenges are unique. Yet the broad patterns of history suggest that civilizations periodically pass through periods of strain. Presently, political institutions are struggling to maintain legitimacy. Public discourse is fragmenting into competing tribes. Cultural confidence is eroding. What begins as political disagreement quickly becomes amplified and, as a result, creates a deeper existential crisis in and of itself. We are watching in real time that in such moments the loudest voices often dominate the conversation. Anger is travelling quickly. Certainty, not curiosity, is now a form of social currency. But history reveals that renewal rarely begins with the loudest voices. Renewal consistently begins with those who continue asking the deeper questions. Those who refuse to surrender intellectual honesty to tribal loyalty. Those who preserve traditions that appear unfashionable but remain essential. Those who maintain moral clarity when cultural language becomes confused. These people rarely think of themselves as a remnant. They are simply individuals who continue to think, question, and preserve. Yet across history, such people have often provided the quiet foundations from which renewal eventually begins. And if you've listened thus far, then perhaps you are closer to the remnant instinct than you first imagined. And if so, then perhaps this space is for you. A place to think more slowly, to listen more carefully, and to engage with ideas that reach beneath the surface. Thank you for taking the time to slow down and listen. My name is DC Bisley, and this has been a reflective essay from the DC Journal.